The rusted iron hinges shrieked like a wounded animal as the heavy crowbar finally broke the century-old seal. Stale dust poured into the corridor, carrying the heavy scent of absolute silence. Behind that forgotten door wasn't just a lost fortune. It was a dark secret someone was actively willing to kill for. November rain lashed relentlessly against the towering glass windows of the Sotheby's auction house in London. But inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly dry. Harrison Caldwell sat in the third row, his tailored charcoal suit entirely at odds with the calloused, scarred hands resting on his knees. At 42, Harrison had built a formidable reputation across Europe and North America as a restorer of lost causes. He bought condemned historical properties, poured his soul and capital into them, and brought them back from the brink of demolition. But his latest target had his financial advisors threatening to quit. On the glowing projection screen at the front of the room was a bleak, drone-captured image of Dunhaven Keep. Located deep in the unforgiving terrain of the Scottish borders, the sprawling 14th-century stone Leviathan looked less like a castle and more like a decaying corpse. Its slate roof had partially collapsed, the eastern turret was choked by aggressive centuries-old ivy, and the surrounding estate was a bog of untamed wilderness. It had been abandoned since 1928. Nobody wanted it. The starting bid was a pitiful £250,000, less than a studio apartment in London. "Going once for 350,000, the auctioneer droned, his voice laced with unmistakable boredom. Harrison raised his paddle. 350. A murmur rippled through the sparsely populated room. A few rows back, a man in a bespoke navy pinstripe suit shifted uncomfortably. This was Nathaniel Haworth, a ruthless London-based hedge fund manager whose portfolio consisted mostly of aggressive corporate takeovers, not crumbling Scottish masonry. Haworth glared at the back of Harrison's head, his jaw tight. Haworth had been the only other bidder, slowly driving the price up from the base, but he had abruptly stopped at 340, perhaps assuming Harrison would fold. He hadn't. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, striking the gavel. "To Mr. Caldwell." Harrison let out a slow breath. He owned Dunhaven. But the victory felt unusually hollow, accompanied by a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. As he stood to leave, Haworth intercepted him in the plush, carpeted lobby. Haworth was a man who reeked of expensive cologne and impatience. "Caldwell, isn't it?" Haworth said, stepping directly into Harrison's path. "I must say, congratulations on acquiring a magnificent pile of rubble. I imagine the asbestos removal alone will bankrupt you." "I like a challenge, Mr. Haworth," Harrison replied evenly, recognizing the man from industry magazines. "Historical preservation rarely comes cheap." "Let me save you the headache," Haworth countered, pulling a silver pen from his breast pocket. "I'll give you £500,000 right now, a clean transfer. You walk away with 150 grand in pure profit for sitting in a chair for 20 minutes. Leave Dunhaven to someone with deeper pockets." Harrison narrowed his eyes. £150,000 in instant profit was a remarkable return, but it was the desperation masking Haworth's arrogant tone that caught Harrison's attention. Why would a ruthless hedge fund manager overpay for a castle that had sat rotting on the market for 3 decades? "It's not for sale, Nathaniel," Harrison said, stepping around him. "But if I find any hidden gold in the walls, I'll be sure to send you a postcard." 2 weeks later, Harrison stood in the muddy courtyard of Dunhaven Keep, the freezing Scottish wind biting through his thick wool coat. Beside him was Declan McIntyre, a burly, red-bearded local contractor whose family had lived in the nearby village for generations. Declan was currently reviewing the massive, rolled-up architectural blueprints Harrison had sourced from the National Archives. "It's a death trap, Harrison," Declan grumbled, tapping a thick finger against the blueprint. The central load-bearing walls in the Great Hall are bowing. The rot in the timber beams goes completely through to the masonry, and the locals won't come up here. My crew is already making excuses about the mud, but the truth is, this place has a reputation. "A ghost story?" Harrison asked, shining his heavy-duty flashlight up into the cavernous, shadowy archway of the main entrance. "Worse," Declan muttered. "Bad luck. The last man to own this place, Lord Hector Wallace, vanished in 1928. Left his tea warm on the table, left his dogs in the kennel, and simply walked off the face of the earth. The estate went into a legal limbo that took 80 years to clear up. People say he made a deal with something awful down in the dark, and it finally came to collect." Harrison didn't believe in curses. He believed in structural integrity, concrete, and steel. But as they spent the first week clearing out decades of debris, Harrison began to realize that Dunhaven was actively fighting them. The environment was aggressively hostile. But it wasn't just the natural decay that was troubling. On the 8th day of the initial survey, Harrison was meticulously measuring the dimensions of the massive underground wine cellar against the 1880 Victorian blueprints. He ran his laser measuring tool from the heavy oak door to the far stone wall. The digital display read 62 feet. Frowning, Harrison looked down at the architectural schematic spread across a makeshift plywood table. According to the original architect's drawings, the cellar should have been exactly 85 feet long. There was a 23-foot discrepancy, a massive architectural void in the eastern foundation that simply did not exist on paper. Harrison walked slowly to the far end of the cellar. The brickwork here was distinctly different from the rest of the room. While the main walls were constructed of large, uneven medieval stones, this back wall was made of uniform, tightly packed Victorian kiln bricks. It wasn't an original wall. It was a partition, erected decades, perhaps centuries after the castle was built. Someone had deliberately sealed off a massive section of the subterranean level. He pressed his ear against the freezing bricks and knocked his knuckles against the masonry. Instead of a dull, solid thud, the impact yielded a faint, hollow reverberation. There was an empty space on the other side. A very large one. The discovery of the phantom void sent a surge of adrenaline through Harrison, but the excitement was immediately overshadowed by a rapid escalation of inexplicable accidents. It started the very next morning. Declan arrived on site to find the heavy-duty diesel generator, their only source of reliable power, completely flooded with muddy water. The protective housing hadn't just leaked, it had been forcibly pried open, the seals deliberately slashed. "Kids from the village," Declan suggested, though his grim expression betrayed his lack of conviction. "Kids looking for a thrill." "Kids don't carry professional wire cutters," Harrison observed, pointing to the cleanly severed ignition cables. "Someone wants us out of here, and they want us out before we can tear down that false wall in the cellar." Refusing to be intimidated, Harrison doubled down. He ordered private security fencing erected around the perimeter and installed motion sensor cameras along the treacherous driveway. While Declan and a skeleton crew of trusted men worked on stabilizing the structural supports in the main hall, Harrison turned to the intellectual side of the puzzle. He needed to know exactly what Lord Hector Wallace was hiding before he started swinging a sledgehammer into potentially load-bearing brickwork. He contacted Clara Higgins, a brilliant, relentlessly persistent historical archivist based at the University of Edinburgh. Clara had helped Harrison trace the provenance of a French chateau 3 years prior. She was a woman who practically lived in the dust of old records, possessing a mind like a steel trap. Harrison sent her photographs of the blueprints and a generous retainer, asking for every scrap of information she could find on Hector Wallace's final years. 3 days later, Clara drove her battered sedan up the muddy mountain road to Dunhaven, her passenger seat overflowing with manila folders. Harrison met her in his makeshift office in the castle's old drawing room, where a portable heater struggled against the bitter damp. "You've stepped into a massive historical cover-up, Harrison," Clara said, entirely skipping pleasantries as she dumped the folders onto his desk. "I dug into the Wallace family finances. By 1917, Lord Hector was effectively bankrupt. He had lost a fortune in terrible shipping investments. The bank was weeks away from foreclosing on Dunhaven." "But they didn't," Harrison noted, pouring her a cup of awful instant coffee. "No, they didn't," Clara agreed, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. In October of 1917, the bank records show a sudden, massive influx of liquid capital. Unmarked bearer bonds, deposited directly into the Bank of Scotland under Wallace's name. It was enough to pay off all his debts and fund a lavish lifestyle for another decade. The timing is the key here, Harrison. October 1917. What else was happening in the world? Harrison thought for a moment. The Russian Revolution. Clara slammed her hand on the table. Exactly. The Bolsheviks were tearing the Romanov dynasty apart. Russian aristocrats were fleeing for their lives, smuggling whatever portable wealth they could carry across the borders. I tracked down the shipping manifest of a merchant vessel that arrived in Edinburgh from St. Petersburg, exactly 3 days before Wallace paid off his debts. Listed as a passenger was a Count Alexei Volkov, a high-ranking loyalist to the Tsar. You think Wallace granted Volkov asylum in exchange for a cut of his smuggled wealth? Harrison asked, looking down at the blueprints. I know he did, Clara said, because Count Volkov never officially left Scotland. There are no death certificates, no property purchases, no outbound passenger records. He simply vanished. And 11 years later, in 1928, Lord Wallace vanishes too. Whatever Volkov brought with him, I bet my career that Wallace hid it down here. Armed with Clara's historical validation, Harrison couldn't wait any longer. That afternoon, he and Declan carried heavy rotary hammers, crowbars, and halogen work lights down the slick, algae-covered stone steps into the cavernous cellar. The air down here was thick, smelling of wet earth and centuries of undisturbed decay. They set up the halogen lights, casting long, harsh shadows against the Victorian brick wall that sealed off the phantom 23 feet. If this brings the whole castle down on our heads, my wife is going to kill you before the rubble does, Declan grunted, hoisting a massive sledgehammer onto his shoulder. Just aim for the center mortar joints, Harrison said, securing his safety goggles. Let's breach it. Declan swung. The heavy steel head of the sledgehammer connected with a deafening crack that echoed violently off the vaulted ceiling. Dust plumed into the air. He swung again and again. On the 5th strike, the Victorian masonry gave way. A cluster of bricks collapsed inward, vanishing into absolute darkness. A rush of frigid, dead air blew out from the hole, carrying a scent that made Harrison's stomach churn. A metallic chemical smell, mixed with old paper. Working feverishly, the two men used crowbars to widen the breach, tearing away the bricks until they had created a jagged hole large enough to walk through. Harrison grabbed a heavy flashlight and stepped over the rubble, his boots crunching loudly in the deafening silence. The void wasn't just an empty room. It was a heavily fortified antechamber. The walls were lined with reinforced steel plating, completely incongruous with the medieval architecture surrounding it. In the center of the far wall stood a massive custom-built vault door. It wasn't a bank vault. It looked industrial, like the bulkhead of a dreadnought battleship, secured by a complex mechanical locking wheel covered in deep rust. "Mother of God," Declan whispered, stepping in behind him and shining his light over the rivets. "Wallace didn't just build a wall. He built a fortress down here." Harrison approached the door, brushing his gloved hand over the freezing metal. There was a secondary padlock looped through a heavy chain on the primary wheel. It was formidable, but nothing an angle grinder couldn't chew through in 20 minutes. He turned to tell Declan to fetch the grinder from the truck. Before he could speak, the halogen work lights in the main cellar behind them violently flickered and died. Total, suffocating darkness instantly swallowed the room. Harrison and Declan froze, their flashlight beams darting frantically across the blackness. The silence was absolute for 3 agonizing seconds. Then from the top of the stone stairs leading down to the cellar came the distinct, heavy sound of a boot scraping against stone. Someone else was down there in the dark with them. The beam of Harrison's flashlight snapped off instantly, plunging the subterranean chamber back into an impenetrable, suffocating blackness. He grabbed Declan's heavy canvas jacket, pulling the massive contractor down behind the shattered remnants of the Victorian brick wall. They crouched in the damp rubble, the only sound the ragged, rapid rhythm of their own breathing and the agonizingly slow, deliberate footsteps descending the stone stairs. "Step away from the bulkhead, Caldwell," a voice echoed through the darkness. It was cold, remarkably calm, and clipped with an elite London accent. It wasn't Nathaniel Hayworth, but the expensive cadence was unmistakably cut from the same cloth. "We know exactly what is behind that. Uldor, you are trespassing on a legacy that does not belong to you." Harrison's mind raced. The severed generator cables, the flooded machinery, the intimidation tactics. It hadn't been local vandals. Haworth had hired professionals. "You're breaking and entering on private property," Harrison called out, his voice echoing deceptively off the vaulted ceiling to mask his exact location. "I've got motion cameras beaming directly to a private security firm in Edinburgh. The police are already on their way." "A bluff," the voice replied smoothly. A high-lumen tactical light suddenly sliced through the darkness, sweeping methodically across the cellar. Behind the blinding beam was the silhouette of a man in a tactical dark windbreaker, holding a heavy steel crowbar. "Hayworth acquired the cellular tower data for this valley. You have no signal down here. Now step out, or we make this exceptionally unpleasant." Declan, kneeling beside Harrison in the dirt, didn't deal in bluffs or corporate negotiations. He dealt in blunt force. Without a word, the Scotsman grabbed a 3-foot length of jagged, shattered iron piping from the debris of the old wall. As the tactical light swept over their position, illuminating the jagged hole in the brickwork, Declan lunged. With a roar that shook the very dust from the ceiling, Declan hurled the heavy pipe like a javelin. It missed the intruder's head by inches, but smashed directly into the tactical flashlight, shattering the lens and plunging them back into chaotic darkness. The intruder shouted in surprise, stumbling backward against a rack of rotted wine barrels. The ancient wood gave way with an explosive crash, sending heavy iron hoops and splintered staves cascading over the man. "Run!" Harrison yelled, grabbing his heavy rotary hammer. They didn't run toward the stairs. The intruder was blocking that path. Instead, they retreated deeper into the secret antechamber, dragging the heavy metal equipment with them. Harrison slammed his shoulder against the edge of the breach they had just created, creating a barricade of loose bricks and heavy machinery. They were trapped in the vault's antechamber, but the narrow breach in the brickwork meant the intruder couldn't easily follow without squeezing through a fatal choke point. "He's calling for backup," Declan whispered harshly, peering through a crack in the bricks. "I can hear him on a two-way radio. We don't have much time before more of them arrive." "Then we don't wait," Harrison said, his jaw set. He fumbled in his tool bag, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy handle of the cordless angle grinder. "If Howarth wants what's in here so badly that he's willing to commit assault, we need to know what we're holding hostage." Harrison flicked on a small pen light, clamping it between his teeth, and stepped up to the massive, rusted vault door. The secondary padlock was a thick block of hardened steel, looped through an iron chain that locked the primary wheel in place. He powered on the grinder. The high-pitched scream of the diamond-tipped blade tearing into steel was deafening in the confined space. A fountain of blinding orange sparks showered over Harrison's heavy coat and leather gloves. The smell of burning metal and ozone quickly filled the cramped antechamber. Outside the breach, the intruder yelled something indiscernible over the noise, but he didn't dare try to push through the jagged opening, while Declan stood guarding it with a sledgehammer. 3 minutes. That was how long it took for the grinder to finally bite through the hardened shackle. With a heavy metallic clank, the broken padlock hit the stone floor. Harrison threw the grinder aside and grabbed the primary locking wheel. It was stiff, frozen by decades of moisture and neglect. "Declan, help me!" Declan wedged his crowbar into the spokes of the heavy iron wheel, and together both men threw their entire body weight against the lever. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then a loud, agonizing groan echoed from deep within the door's internal mechanisms. The heavy tumblers, slick with age-old grease, began to turn. Clack, clack, thunk. The locking bolts retracted. Harrison gripped the heavy iron handle and pulled. The immense door swung outward with surprising smoothness, revealing a secondary chamber perfectly preserved in a vacuum of dry air. Harrison aimed his flashlight into the room, expecting to see crates of smuggled Russian gold or stacks of negotiable bearer bonds. Instead, the beam illuminated a macabre tableau that made the blood freeze in his veins. Sitting in the center of the room, arranged around a small, rotting velvet card table, were 2 skeletal figures slumped in high-backed leather chairs. The dry, sealed environment had preserved the horrifying scene perfectly. One skeleton was draped in the tattered remains of a bespoke 1920s tweed suit. The other wore the faded, moth-eaten remnants of an Imperial Russian military tunic. Between them on the table sat a single, rusted Webley revolver, an overturned crystal decanter, and a mountain of shimmering, flawless diamonds. It wasn't just a treasure vault. It was a tomb. Lord Hector Wallace and Count Alexei Volkov hadn't vanished. They had murdered each other in the dark. The deafening wail of police sirens finally pierced the howling Scottish wind, shattering the tense standoff. The intruders, realizing their window of opportunity, had violently slammed shut, fled the castle grounds long before Inspector Colin Davies of the Police Scotland Major Investigations Unit kicked his way through the cellar doors. Harrison and Declan emerged from the vault, exhausted, covered in a thick layer of brick dust and metallic soot. As the police secured the perimeter and strung bright yellow crime scene tape across the medieval masonry, Harrison finally had the opportunity to properly examine the staggering contents of the secret chamber. The skeletons were carefully photographed and removed by forensic anthropologists, leaving behind the true legacy of Dunhaven Keep. The fortune was vast, but its composition was far more complex than simple smuggled wealth. Clara Higgins arrived on the scene hours later, having practically flown up the mountain roads. Together with Harrison and Inspector Davies, they began to inventory the chaotic aftermath of a century-old betrayal. The true treasure of Dunhaven Keep consisted of the Volkov diamonds, over 400 loose, unmounted diamonds of astonishing clarity, originally sewn into the lining of the Count's heavy winter coat. The imperial bearer bonds, stacks of defunct financial instruments issued by the Russian State Bank in 1914, completely worthless today, but historically priceless. The Fabergé cigarette case, a solid gold, enamel-inlaid case bearing the personal crest of Tsar Nicholas II, a masterpiece of pre-revolutionary craftsmanship. The Wallace Ledgers, a stack of leather-bound journals detailing the dark financial underbelly of the Scottish aristocracy during the First World War. It was the final item, a blood-stained, leather-bound journal resting near Lord Wallace's skeletal hand, that finally explained the desperate violence of the present day. Clara, wearing white archival cotton gloves, carefully turned the stiff yellowed pages under the harsh glare of the police work lights. "This is a full confession," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. "Wallace didn't just shelter Volkov, he imprisoned him." According to the frantic, sprawling handwriting, Wallace had taken the initial payment from the Count in 1917, promising him safe passage and a new identity. Instead, heavily indebted to a ruthless underground syndicate in London, Wallace drugged the Russian aristocrat and locked him in the newly constructed vault. For 11 years, Wallace systematically tortured the Count, extorting the locations of secret bank accounts across Europe to fund his lavish lifestyle and pay off his criminal financiers. "But what happened in 1928? Harrison asked, looking at the rusted Webley revolver bagged in plastic on the evidence table. "Volkov finally broke free," Clara deduced, reading the last erratic entry. "Somehow, he picked the lock on his iron cell while Wallace was down here, demanding more funds. A struggle ensued. Volkov managed to grab Wallace's revolver. He shot Wallace, but in the ensuing chaos, the heavy vault door swung shut, locking from the outside. Both men had died in the dark, one from a gunshot wound, the other from slow starvation. Surrounded by a fortune in diamonds he could never spend. "That explains the historical tragedy," Inspector Davies noted, crossing his arms. "But it doesn't explain why a team of corporate thugs tried to cave your head in tonight, Mr. Caldwell." Harrison flipped to the back of the ledger, where a list of names and financial disbursements was meticulously recorded. He ran his finger down the list of Wallace's criminal financiers, stopping abruptly at a familiar name. "Here," Harrison said, his voice hard. "Elias Howarth, Nathaniel Howarth's grandfather. He wasn't just a banker, he was the head of the syndicate that financed Wallace's extortion ring. This ledger contains the original blackmail material, signed contracts, and direct evidence of the Howarth family's foundational wealth being built on the torture and extortion of a Russian refugee." The pieces violently snapped into place. Nathaniel Haworth hadn't been trying to buy the castle to flip it. He had been monitoring the property for years, waiting for the legal limbo to clear so he could quietly purchase it, excavate the vault, and destroy the ledgers before his family's dark, bloody legacy could be exposed to the public. When Harrison outbid him, Howarth panicked. The offer of a quick £500,000, the sabotage, the armed thugs, it was all a desperate attempt to burn the evidence of his family's sins. The fallout was spectacular and merciless. Armed with the historical evidence from the vault and the testimonies of the arrested mercenaries, the authorities descended on Haworth's London offices. The ruthless hedge fund manager was indicted for conspiracy, corporate espionage, and funding organized violence. His firm's stock plummeted, his assets were frozen, and his immaculate reputation was utterly destroyed overnight. The treasures of Dunhaven, legally classified as the proceeds of a historic crime and lacking any living Volkov heirs, were officially seized by the Crown. However, in recognition of his role in uncovering the truth and securing the artifacts, Harrison was awarded a massive finder's fee by the British government, a sum exceeding £3 million. 2 years later, Harrison Caldwell stood in the grand hall of Dunhaven Keep. The ivy had been meticulously cleared, the slate roof fully restored, and the oppressive gloom replaced by the warm, inviting glow of iron chandeliers. The castle was no longer a rotting tomb. It was a magnificent, breathing piece of history. He had transformed the fortress into a luxury heritage hotel, its dark past serving as the ultimate, thrilling attraction for guests from around the world. The phantom void in the cellar remained open, safely preserved behind thick museum glass, a silent monument to the price of greed. Harrison Caldwell proved that some hidden treasures aren't just buried wealth, they are buried truths, waiting for the right person to unearth them. Dunhaven Keep stands today not as a cursed ruin, but as a testament to resilience and justice. If you were captivated by this intense journey into the dark heart of history, hit that like button, share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life mysteries